Hello, and thank you for coming along. Today we're going to look at DU and the worldwide disinformation wars, why the public is sleepwalking to the end of the earth. This is stimulated by the initial thought and presentations back in the last century by Noam Chomsky on how political power uses propaganda to distract the public. It was part of his manufacturing consent installation of thoughts and broadcasts after the publication of the book called Manufacturing Consent. Political power has used this ever since to lie and deceive the public about what's going on in their name. Nevermore has this been more successful. Never before than with the issue of depleted uranium, now currently back in the news, very ominously, because we don't remember why the public is sleepwalking to the end of the earth. We don't remember. Our leaders don't remember what happened just a few decades ago. Today we're going to have a look. Putin warns UK over depleted uranium weapons. You can catch any of these stories on Transition Studies by just calling them up and clicking on them. The UK responds that there's no nuclear escalation in the Ukraine after row over depleted uranium munitions. They say they're not dangerous. In fact, they say they're not nuclear. They're confusing nuclear dust with nuclear weapons and hoping that the public won't understand. For the most part, the public won't understand because it doesn't know about this. There's a tragic legacy of deception behind the history of the use of depleted uranium, and the American media has been particularly blind in this regard, swallowing what was put forward by two Bush administrations and replicating it on a grander scale, and now extending it to other parts of the world, first under President Bill Clinton to the Kosovo wars, and now, it seems, through the British to the Ukrainian conflict. But those from Syria remember, birth defects in Iraq surpass those of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this is well documented in a documentary put out before the second Bush War, based only on the first Bush War, the 1991 Bush War, but before the 2003 invasions. The 1991 Bush War in Iraq was called Desert Storm, and a documentary was made called Hidden Wars of Desert Storm, largely by the veterans who suffered the consequences of depleted uranium. This is a very powerful film, but it's been suppressed. There's been a further documentary put out 2 years earlier, upon which the outrage, in a sense, was based. It was called Double-Edged Weapon, put out in 1999 by a group of journalists called Journeyman Pictures. It's worth seeing that as well. We'll probably view that next week. But for the moment, you can call it up from Transition Studies. Here it's very well documented that Iraqi human rights campaigners were objecting to what was done during the first Bush War, the 1991 war of George H.W. Bush. Let's have another look at the 2001 documentary recording the memory of many of those who participated in the first Bush War, and underscoring that those who came later and suppressed the information seem themselves to have forgotten, or would like us to forget, the legacy of the two Iraq wars. This is something we cannot afford to do in the face of the use of DU weapons, depleted uranium weapons, in the current Ukrainian conflict. Let's have a look at this 2001 documentary made largely by U.S. war veterans of the first Iraq War.
Proclaimed as a sweeping victory by almost all Western media, the Gulf War and the subsequent crisis with Iraq have indeed amounted to a superior victory for Washington. Paramount arms sales at a level never seen before, at last huge permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia, resulting in a better control of the oil flow and a better leverage on its pricing. The great losers, on the other hand, are the Iraqi population, still under a Stalin-like dictatorship and slowly dying from starvation. But the losers, however, are not just distant populations of the Middle East. Some of the victims of the Gulf War have also turned out to be right amongst the presumable victors of the war.
In 1991, most Americans were very happy that the Gulf War apparently had ended. It was a quick, decisive victory, and hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops were returning home to parades. What happened a few months later was that thousands of veterans started to report medical problems, such as achy joints, memory problems. They kept falling ill, they were getting rashes, and there was no explanation.
Concerning the use of the type of weapons used by the Allies in the Gulf War, the first warning came from soldiers themselves, whether in Britain or in the US, when they started complaining of symptoms, and that was related to the Gulf War and to the use of the weapons. So it's obvious that it took so long until people took it seriously, because there was this conspiracy of silence.
The first response of the United States military and the United States government was to ignore it, to deny that there was any problem with the health status of American Gulf War veterans.
You had to keep the image of the good guys, namely the Allied, and the bad guy, who is Saddam. It's Saddam Hussein who would use chemical weapons and who would harm his own population and the world with this type of weapons. And it didn't look very nice to show that the Allies have been themselves using weapons that were harmful.
In the 1970s, through the 1980s, the Pentagon, in complete secrecy, started experimenting with a new type of high-perforation shell made of the heaviest, hardest, most plentiful metal around, readily available without mining costs or efforts. A metal that just happened to be sitting there in the hands of the U.S. Department of Energy. Uranium waste.
The U.S. Department of Energy and other nations that are involved in the enrichment have tremendous amounts of this waste left over, and they needed to find a use for it.
Depleted uranium rounds reached combat for the first time during the Gulf War. These rounds pierce anything known to this day, penetrating the thickest armor plates like butter. The downside: they are radioactive, contain traces of plutonium, the most toxic metal on Earth, and their debris remain radioactive for about 4.5 billion years.
Depleted uranium is a very hazardous toxic waste. For example, depleted uranium settles in the bone, it settles in the lungs, it settles in the liver, in the kidney, and also in the muscle and testicles. This is an experiment upon rats. Depleted uranium also crosses from a mother through the placenta to a fetus. All this information is widely available. However, the Pentagon, in their overwhelming desire, their passion to use depleted uranium weapons, is trying to suppress this medical research about its high toxicity.
I could go through the early reports on this issue. You know, this is one from July 1990, where they say the most exposed individuals and soldiers who go onto a battlefield after DU rounds are shot, saying that civilians and soldiers may suffer health effects from inhalation and ingestion of DU dust, and even saying that once people realize the health environmental effects of this weapon, there may be a move to ban it. And this was July 1990. This is just 6 months or so before the war. So you have to wonder why no warnings were ever disseminated to any ground forces prior to the war, even just to say, stay away from the vehicles that have been hit. Don't go climbing on the equipment afterwards.
What the military didn't do was tell the soldiers that the ammunition used by our airplanes and our tanks during the Gulf War was made out of this highly toxic radioactive substance.
And because we didn't know about the radioactive waste being used as ammunition, people were just picking up things in the desert, whatever they could find as a war trophy. And I think that if they would have known, they would have never touched it.
More than 436,000 U.S. troops are confirmed to have entered into those areas of radioactive toxic waste. And sadly, some soldiers camped in areas contaminated by depleted uranium, radioactive toxic waste for up to 2 months without any idea, without any warning at all.
I just want to say something about the Iraqis too, that I've seen a lot of photos and talked to people who've been to Iraq, and I've also seen photos of Bedouins who go out in the desert and they go to the destroyed tanks, and I've seen photos of them literally digging in the sand next to these tanks to look for scrap metal, and they've been doing this for years, and they take the scrap metal that they can find and they go and they sell it so they can buy food. This is the situation in Iraq.
If we compare the mortalities, that is, the patients died because of cancer, in 1988 we have only 34 patients died because of cancer. But in 1998 we recorded 428 patients died because of cancer. Cancer which affects elderly people now. It's seen in younger age groups. I have a patient who have cancer of the ovary who is only 11 years old.
Cancer and death strike the children even before they are born. At the children's hospital, malformed babies happen at the frightening rate of 1 or 2 a day.
Who's responsible today? At the highest levels where the United States made the decision to produce and use uranium-238, otherwise known as depleted uranium munitions in combat.
The Department of Energy is in charge of maintaining the stockpile of depleted uranium in this country, which we have about 1.5 billion pounds. Basically what they want to do is recycle it so that they don't have to hold it anymore. It's just going to go to defense industry to be used in ammunition.
The Pentagon has good reasons to deny the toxicity of uranium waste and the contamination of both the local populations and the Allied forces.
They cannot admit that today many of us are sick, that Iraqis are sick. This is all about 2 things: liability and dollars to clean up the mess that was created around the world.
Medical tests and treatments have been delayed or denied to most Gulf War veterans in an effort to evade both moral responsibility and health care costs.
The Army spent 3 years trying to discharge me with no pension. They just kicked me out and didn't want to take responsibility for my medical conditions.
As shocking and disturbing as it is, this attitude from the Pentagon is nothing new.
The use of radioactive toxic waste, called depleted uranium, by the military is another sad chapter in a long and tortured history of the United States military. During World War II and shortly afterward, hundreds of U.S. soldiers were told to stand outside and witness atomic bomb blasts. It wasn't until the 1990s that many of these veterans stepped forward and demanded health care and benefits as a result of being human guinea pigs. During the 1960s and 70s, the United States military used a defoliant called Agent Orange that contains the deadly cancer-causing agent dioxin. This Agent Orange was sprayed on trees and shrubs in Vietnam in order to destroy all the foliage.
The debate went on for Agent Orange for years, that the Pentagon was saying no one was exposed to enough to cause any health problems. And we're in the same boat now with depleted uranium.
The amount of lies told by the U.S. government on this issue are so spectacular as to be mind-boggling.
Depleted uranium rounds have not only been spread all over Kuwait and southern Iraq, they have also been sprinkled all across Kosovo and Serbia, and are shot on a daily basis in such places as Vieques, Puerto Rico, and Okinawa, Japan, for training purposes and without any warning to the local populations. Today, 15 countries altogether possess and shoot ammunitions made of radioactive nuclear waste and are ready to sell them to whoever wants to buy them.
We don't have to litter the battlefield with something that's hazardous for 4.5 billion years. The world needs to ban the use of uranium munitions, period.
Many more laws and international safeguard regulations need to be enacted to prevent the recurrence of any such ordeal from the part of any government and against any population or country in the world.
We don't remember. Our leaders don't remember what happened just a few decades ago.